I've been thinking about a lot of different things that I wanted to talk about. And I just recently listened to a podcast by Joe Rogan where he interviewed the author Chuck Palahniuk, who is most famous for writing Fight Club. And their discussion that they had was a very, very interesting discussion, especially someone like me who is and has begun his journey as a writer the last few years, although I've been writing for a good portion of my life. So it's not like I just now dropped into writing, although attempting to make it full-time work is what I'm currently doing. And so just listening on an author to author kind of level has been interesting, but they talked about a lot of things that kind of piggyback on some of the thoughts that I've been having that I wanted to share with you. And so I guess because it's been on my mind, I might as well go into it. I will say at the outset, I'm going to link to the podcast in the description below, but there is language and they do talk about things that maybe some of you will find offensive or not something that you might want to dive into. And that's perfectly okay. But that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, I'm not going to be bringing up anything that's necessarily what the kids call triggering these days, or anything. And I'm not somebody who uses coarse language, so that's not necessarily something that you have to worry about if you're listening to this video. But I do want to make that caveat, even though sometimes I kind of almost get apprehensive when I feel like I need to make that kind of disclaimer. And I understand in part why I need to, because a lot of people who are in my circle of acquaintances or friends and family are very religious and have very particular views about what one ought to or ought not to listen to or talk about. And that's going to be part of what we're going to be talking about in this video. And I do write things that, if they're not oriented to children, I kind of want children to be able to read. And actually, I'm currently working on a children's book, so I also understand the possibility that children might end up at some point, maybe not now, but maybe in the future, come across something like this, and I wouldn't want to be responsible for exposing them to something that their parents or they would not want to be exposed to at the moment. So there are reasons to at least selectively censor or give a caveat to. It's just sometimes I feel like it feels like in the circles that I run in, there's often these caveats that everybody is expected to put in, even though everybody knows that you're going to put in those caveats. Is like, oh, I love that movie. Oh, except for this scene and this thing and this language and this, but I really love that movie. And and it's like almost like we have this kind of odd I don't know, way of talking that sometimes just, I don't know, gets under my skin in some ways. But anyway, I don't know how much of that is going in. I might cut a lot of that out. Um, but anyway, so the podcast, a lot of what Joe and Chuck talked about were things that had to deal with writing, but writing scenes and writing books that make people uncomfortable, but express certain truths that that displayed emotional vulnerability on the part of the author, but then, in a sense, by being emotionally vulnerable in what was written, allows the reader to then be emotionally vulnerable themselves and potentially face some of the traumatic events of their lives, and then heal from that. Um, I can't give it. So if you go and you listen to it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I want to talk about this maybe in the context of some of the stuff that that I've dealt with on a personal level, and with myself, my writing, and the writing that I've run into with other people. So here in Huntsville, Alabama, I've run into a lot of other authors who have written things that I've read and that I have found to be fantastic. In fact, I should go ahead and grab some of those books. I'll be right back. So as I was saying, I've run into some authors and books that I've come into contact with, or sometimes I've been in critique sessions and I've read like portions of books, and they wouldn't necessarily be anything that I would necessarily write, but I found them to be profound and wonderful, and sometimes sickeningly sad or horrible at the same time. They're terrific books that sometimes I'm hesitant to recommend to certain people because of the various sensibilities that some people have. So let me share a couple of these because they have meant something to me so far. So the first one is, I don't have the actual book because I got it on Kindle, but I do have a comic version. He kind of did like the first chapter as a graphic novel as well, and he named it the same thing. So I think you can see that a little bit. When You Bleed to Death by Jeremy Brona. And it's a novel that has self-cutting, and drug abuse in the book. And it's hard to read at times, but it was so profound and moving and gut-wrenching that it was a great book. It was a fantastic book, and it talked about experiences that people have that are hard to talk about and are gut-wrenching, and that truth that comes through in the book, like sometimes, like it's hard sometimes to find words to describe it. Like, it's brutal and it's honest, but those kinds of words are also used so often that sometimes they feel like a cliche, but that's truly what that book is. And it's wonderful, and it's sad, and I don't know what more to say about it. And another book that I've come across, and actually I've got to confess, I've only read half of it because in part there are parts that are hard to read, but this has been the half that I have read has been really wonderful, and I'm going to finish it at some point. But this is Moon River by Amber D. Tran. And this has been wonderful for a few different reasons. She writes of, it's the truth of elementary school life in the 90s. Her character is a little bit younger than where I was when I was in elementary school, and lived in a different part, and it's set in a different part of the country than where I grew up. But it was like small town elementary school drama that it was like I felt like I was transported back in time. And she confronts in that book some real horrible things that that happen when you're young and you're trying to figure out life and you're trying to figure out sexuality and you're trying to figure out friends and you're trying to figure out all sorts of things, and it all gets muddled up together and it all gets messed up together, and you end up doing things in part because you're naive and you don't understand what you're doing, and then those things can really mess with you and stick with you throughout the rest of your life. And so that the book is great. The part that I've read is great. It's not for the faint of heart in some ways. And it has, and both of those books have scenes in them that I can hear. Like, I can hear church people or people who have a certain idea about how things ought to be, or what things should be. They would object to it, and they would be horrified that I would even put the names of those books up and praise them the way that I have, and they would be horrified that I would say that there's anything positive that comes out of them. But just like I heard in the Joe Rogan podcast and the interview with Chuck Palahniuk, was that oftentimes these stories, we object to them because they're almost too real. And we know how dangerous life can be, how dangerous certain things can be. And in some ways, life is better if you can get through it without self-harm, or if you can get through it without some kind of sexual trauma or abusive relationship. But the people who do are lucky. The people who get out of childhood or get out of life without those experiences are lucky. And I discovered that more and more when I worked as a preacher in Wichita, Kansas, that when you start ministering to people and you find out who they are, and sometimes stories come out, people who are in the church, people who are outside of the church, you hear stories 100 times worse than anything that you've read in a book or seen in a movie. And it's real. It's what these people went through. It's the trauma that they went through, and that you wouldn't even guess is behind the facade that they put up when they meet strangers, when they go to church every week and they sit in a pew and they smile and they sing. You have no idea how broken some of these people are. And sadly, there's this attitude within the church. And it's not everywhere, but it's in a lot of churches. And I think a lot of people feel this way, of like that in church, you can't express how you're hurting, or how you have hurt, or how you hurt someone else, which in turn causes you hurt because you realize how much hurt you've caused. But because we have this false belief that everything needs to be perfect at church, everything needs to be perfect in our homes. Everything needs to be perfect in our family. Everything needs to be perfect. These events in our lives that cause us so much pain and hurt and brokenness end up getting pushed aside, getting stifled and pushed down deep inside of us, or we're told to like put that aside and put on a face. And because a lot of these things are internal, emotional, mental, spiritual kinds of brokenness, we think that it's not as broken as if we had something physical done to us. When something physical is done to us, if like we get cut, or a bone gets broken, or we have to go through an amputation, or all sorts of things that are physical, like we understand is like, oh yeah, you've got to treat that. You've got to recognize the wound that you have, diagnose it, and then treat it. Like, it wouldn't make sense to have a gaping wound and then tell somebody, oh, just pretend like it doesn't exist. It'll go away. But we do that with our emotional and spiritual hurts. These wounds that we have somewhere deep inside our hearts, and we pretend that somehow they're just going to heal themselves, and the best that we can possibly hope for is a massive scar somewhere and deep inside us that impedes our emotional mobility. So let me tell you a story. When I was a preacher, and I was a preacher for a small congregation, and our group was very evangelistic focused. And as the evangelist myself, there was a lot of expectation for me to bring in people into the church. And at the time, I also saw that as my responsibility. Like that was what I was supposed to do. But I don't know that I was necessarily ever very good at it. But I guess that's beside the point. But I remember having this conversation with a car mechanic. My car was in getting something done. I had an old car that barely ran, and I had to take it to the mechanic a lot. And I just remember one time I had this car at the mechanics, and I'd been waiting for a while, and one of the guys comes in, and he's in the lobby, and he's going over the various things that they're doing and how much it's going to cost. And then after that, we started talking, and I can't remember exactly how we got onto the topic, but he started telling me about his grandfather, and telling me that his grandfather was the best man that he had ever known. And his grandfather, he wished that he could be more like his grandfather. And then he told me that his grandfather died like maybe a decade ago from cancer. And this man, he was telling me this story. He was being very open and bearing this story to me about this man who was the most important man in his life, and telling me this incredibly vulnerable moment where that man was taken away from him. And he used coarse language when he talked about cancer. Like, I can't remember what the word he used was, but he said something along the lines of cancer is, and then fill in the blank, whatever it was. And then I told him a story about how a disease had taken away one of my grandmothers a lot sooner than she probably should have gone, and we kind of commiserated in a way, and we had a moment where we connected human being to human being, and we connected in our shared misery. but it was like, a comforting kind of moment as well. And then he asked me what I did for a living. And I told him that I was a preacher. And then all of a sudden, this mechanic, he straightens up and he realizes that in the course of talking to me, he's been using a lot of foul language. And then also, I think he recognized that his grandfather also would not have approved of the language that he was using. Because I was a preacher, I was this stand-in for his grandfather. I suddenly became that for him, or something equivalent to it. And so then he started apologizing to me for using that language. Even though the truth is that cancer absolutely is whatever four-letter word or whatever he used to describe it. Like that wasn't an untruth. It might have been crass, but for a disease like cancer, some could argue that perhaps crassness is what's needed to adequately express what you're trying to express. So I wasn't gonna fault him for that. And then also at the same time is like, I'm not his judge. I don't hold people to a moral standard without even telling them what my moral standard is. It's an interesting thing when you tell somebody that you don't really use language, or you don't, or you don't drink, or you don't do certain things. Some people get really offended and get really mad at that, and then other people get really apologetic and will be very open to not cussing around you or not doing certain things around you. It doesn't really bother me personally one way or the other. As I kind of joke with some people, I went through public school. I've heard every word that there possibly is. And I heard them from the mouths of very young children when I was a very young child. And truth be told, at some points in my life, I said them. And but that's probably another story for another day. I try to avoid it as much as I can now, but it's personal reasons why I do that. So I tell that story because in that moment where I was conversing with him and I was having this really, in a sense, a deep spiritual moment with this man. I also remember one other thing is like he had like a tattoo on his neck that you could just kind of see out past his collar. That was another thing that he did. Like he would start like pulling up his collar a little bit, like, and moving it so that to kind of hide the tattoo from me, like I hadn't seen it, or that I was somehow going to now be offended by it. But then I realized that I couldn't invite this man to come to my church, because I knew that there would be people who would criticize him about his tattoo. And I knew that maybe he would be in a position where maybe if he did come and he talked to some of the people, and maybe he would accidentally let a swear word out. And then what would they say to him? Would they be the kind of vindictive, judgmental people that would say, "Don't use that language," and da 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 da, and make him feel very even more uncomfortable and than he already was? Or would they treat him in the sense of understanding that he made a big effort to come to a church, and he made a big effort, although he failed, to try to clean up his language? And I don't know. Like it's like one of those things where you realize that I don't know. Okay, so let me start over. It's one of those things where you realize that On one hand, you're told that the church is for sinful people, and sinful people need to come to the church, and that's where they're supposed to be, and the church is supposed to help sinful people and be there for sinful people. And then when sinful people come to the church, they get turned away because they're sinful. And they don't always get turned away directly. They get turned away because people won't interact with them quite the same way that they interact with everybody else. They don't come in their quote unquote Sunday best, and maybe they have a few tattoos, or maybe they come in smelling of tobacco smoke, or maybe they say a few swear words, or maybe they, who knows? Like, the list goes on and on and on about things that, if you go into a typical church that you don't normally see or normally experience, and then those people come in, and even if nobody directly says, "Oh, you shouldn't be here," the way that people react to those people, the way that the vibe that people get or give off, the vibe that sometimes a church can give without even saying anything, can make a potential visitor feel so uncomfortable that they're never going to come back again, that they're never going to feel like they can open up about the real hurt that they have. And if we claim that Christianity can deal with, and that Jesus can deal with the hurt and brokenness of people, then there's a disconnect there. We're not inviting those people, or we're indirectly or directly keeping those people from actually coming in and being open and honest. But I'll even go further, is that even in church, even in church settings, there are people who come regularly, who will attend regularly, and they have just as broken lives as that car mechanic or anybody else. And maybe sometimes they have even more broken lives. They have abuse in their past, or maybe they were themselves the abuser, or they've dealt with death of a loved one and they've never quite gotten over it, or maybe they're dealing with an illness that they can't quite cope with, or maybe there's problems at home, their children, their parents, their whatever it might be. And maybe they also have pornography addiction, or they have drug addictions, or they have sex addictions, or they have affairs, or they have all sorts of different kinds of things that get hidden or swept under the rug, or pretended that they don't exist, but they come dressed nicely, smiling every Sunday, and they continue to be broken. And if they were to actually express what they were actually going through in church, they would get the same reaction, like, "Why are you bringing this up in church?" But a lot of times I've felt like it was like, well, if you can't bring it up in church, where can you bring it up? Where can you bring it up? And so in my career as a preacher, and I was in my early to mid 20s when I was doing that, I had that sense that there should be more to this. And I think it falls under the idea of confession. Now, oftentimes we think of confession, and I think that this is true, confession in the sense of like you need to confess your sins. But sometimes the brokenness that we experience, or the things that really hurt us, sometimes are our own sins. But sometimes it's the sins of somebody else that's been done to us that have hurt us and broken us. And we kept that swept under the rug too. And I really believe that there's a need to confess those things as well, to confess all of your hurts, to confess all of your brokenness, whether it's your responsibility or someone else's responsibility, or maybe it's somewhere in between. The real way in which to experience healing is you've got to first acknowledge that it happened. And that's so difficult. That's so difficult. And there were times where I would preach a sermon and I would give a personal anecdote from myself. And sometimes they would be very personal and hard to admit kinds of things about something in my life, some struggle that I had, some problem that I had at some point in my life, and maybe how I got over it, or maybe how I'm still dealing with it. As I mentioned, I went through a phase in my life where I had a problem using swear words a lot more than I should have, or I went through a point in my life where I was an atheist and I withdrew from the church. There are other examples. I can't think of any off the top of my head other than those, but I can remember some times where I would preach a sermon and I'd use myself as the example. And it was very hard for me to do that, but it seemed very meaningful. It seemed like if we were to really get somewhere, somebody needed to start by being vulnerable and being like, here's my problem. And who to do that other than the preacher? Like, I don't know that I can stand up and preach a sermon and say, no, everybody else, you need to do this. And so I tried to give an example the best I could. And then there were times where after I do that, after the service, I'd be standing in the back and greeting people as they leave. And then somebody would come up to me and they would joke about the example that I made about myself to me, as if it wasn't one of the hardest things for me to talk about, as if it wasn't a big deal. And sometimes they'd be laughing about it or making a joke at my expense. And that happened several times. And it was one of the most painful things that I went through. There were a lot of painful things in being a preacher that I went through, but that was one of the most painful ones, like kind of emotionally. And afterwards I'd be wondering, like, is there a value to actually being vulnerable in front of people? And that's actually a weird thing, because that's some comments that I got from the last video, is people were impressed by my vulnerability. And I don't really know why that's impressive. I in some ways, I just kind of said that I don't always like going to church, but I guess that's an incredibly vulnerable thing to say around church people, because we're all expected to want to go to church, and it's a bad thing to not want to. And maybe there were other things in there as well that express my vulnerability. I guess that's how, in some ways, I've pushed myself to be. And what you realize is, even though those things might be hurtful and people, might joke with you or exploit some of those things, what you really realize when you put yourself out there like that is that when people do that, like they'll joke at your expense, or they'll bring it up and then they'll rub you with it, or they'll try to do something with it, they'll laugh about it or something. What they're really doing is they're expressing their own fears, their own vulnerabilities, and their own pent up issues. And it's easier for them to make fun of you or to laugh about it at your expense than it is at their expense. And so that's what you learn is that, like, and potentially that's their first step in eventually getting around to admitting it to themselves. So even though it might be a hard process to be vulnerable and then be used when you make yourself vulnerable, there's the potential that it can be really helpful to some people. I say that, and then I want to come back to that, because if you open yourself up to criticism, it's hard to face laughter or ridicule or criticism or judgment. And unfortunately, the church is filled with a lot of people who will be judgmental. And sometimes, and just to be honest, sometimes it's been me who's been the judgmental one. I don't want to, like, every time I say church people, like, I'm not leaving myself necessarily out of the equation. I've been guilty of that. And I'm not discounting the possibility that I might be guilty of it in the future. Like, I don't want to be, but I realize my own faults in regards to that. And it's awful and it's painful to deal with putting yourself out there and then people not giving you the space to be vulnerable. And they treat it like it's something to be ridiculed, or they treat it like it's something to just be like tossed about, like it's nothing. And what you've done is you've revealed your emotional or spiritual nakedness to them, and they haven't treated it with reverence. And that reminds me of, and that's why I want to end with this, the idea of where that comes from. You know, if I explain, like, being vulnerable is like emotional nakedness, you and everybody else understands what that means. You know, you don't have to be physically naked to feel naked, right? And that comes up in the story of the fall, of Adam and Eve eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And there's so many things about that story that resonate with this idea for the need to be vulnerable, and confession, and other things that go along with that. And I want to share just a couple of things from that story that potentially relate to this, and is one of the things that I've found in discussions with Christians or at Bible studies, when eventually they come to the Genesis and the fall, and sometimes it's the first thing that they talk about. Not a lot of people take time to think about, what does the fact that it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil mean? Right? There are two trees identified in the Garden of Eden. There's the tree of life, which makes sense to us, but then the way that the story goes, where the Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, and then they get cursed, and then they get thrown out of the Garden of Eden, is that I think you would expect the tree to be the tree of evil. But it's not the tree of evil. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so what is that? What is the knowledge of good and evil? So think about that in your own life. Like, when in your life do you understand the difference between good and evil? Like, really understand it. Like, in those moments in your life where the contrast between evil and good become starkly evident, I would pose that those things happen. That happens when you understand the difference between good and evil, is when you make a bad choice, or you see somebody else make a bad choice. And then the consequences flow out, and you see, or you experience, good and evil. And you realize that good and evil are not just made up terms, but are actual real things that affect us. and that we participate in, whether good or evil. And we have knowledge of that. And in the story, this knowledge of good and evil is a tree, and Eve takes the fruit after being tempted by the serpent. And I'm not going to get into that. Like, we might talk about that in some other video. But she takes of it and she eats it. And it says after she eats it, she gives it to Adam, and he eats it, and their eyes are opened. And that's one of the things that, like, they've been seeing, but you use that kind of term of like your eyes are open to another reality, good and evil. Before that, they didn't really understand or know the difference between good and evil. But after that moment, their eyes were opened and they could see. They had the knowledge of good and evil. And so when you make a poor decision in your life and things go poorly, or you get broken, or somebody else does it and does it to you, your eyes are opened. You know the difference. At least in that context, you know the difference between good and evil. And it says after that they were naked. They saw that they were naked. Now, what does that mean? Now, I've heard some people in some conservative churches say they realized that being naked was bad. That's not what they realized. They realized they were naked. They were husband and wife. They were the only two humans. There was no problem with them being naked around each other. There was nothing wrong in the Garden of Eden with being naked. They weren't being evil, and then all of a sudden they had the knowledge that they were being evil in the past. That's not what happened. It's in realizing the difference between good and evil, in eating from the tree, in experiencing that, in going against God's commands, they then learned the difference between good and evil, and they realized that they had made a choice that had affected them on a deep spiritual level. And they realized that they were naked. And so there's this kind of there's this physical recognition of their nakedness, but their physical recognition of their nakedness is a manifestation of their spiritual nakedness. It's and that's how often, that's why we talk about it in terms of vulnerability. Nakedness is the ultimate vulnerability. And so we're afraid of being vulnerable with other people because it exposes us. These are all the terms that we use, and we use them metaphorically, and it's all about nakedness because that's how it feels. That's what it's like. When you know the difference between good and evil, and you've experienced it and you've been broken by it, it makes you vulnerable. It makes you exposed. It makes you naked. And you've got to cover it up. You've got to feel like you've got to do something. And so they cover themselves up the best they can with fig leaves, which doesn't really do much. God knows that they've been changed. And there's this interesting thing is you can't, even after they partially confess to God, they say, yeah, we ate it, but this person made me. They don't quite fully confess, but they mostly confess. And even after confession, there are things that happen you can't go back. No matter how much you wish that you could go back. Right after the sin has been committed, and I know that there are some people out there that don't like religious terms like sin, but in some ways it's how else do you describe not just the physical realities of something like child abuse, other than to also include the spiritual dimension, that it's wrong. And it's not just wrong because we've been morally conditioned to believe it's wrong, or societally conditioned to believe it's wrong, but it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. It is sin. Like, that word is meaningful. And when you come across it and you come up against it, it's like that. There's no other word. There's no other word. And so after that, you can't go back to not realizing that you're naked. You can't go back. It's like, you can be naive, but after you've been relieved of your naivety, you can't go back to being naive. The knowledge of good and evil sticks with you. It sticks with you forever. And that's part of like what the story of the fall is. The fall has there's so many levels to it. Like I'm only like scratching the surface. But that's part of what the fall the story of the fall is teaching us. Is that after you cross that threshold, whether you cross it or somebody else makes you cross it, and that happens. Eve eats the apple and then she gives it to Adam, like. And they both get cursed. They both realize that they're naked. They both get cursed. They both get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Like, there are things, it's like after that, you cannot go back. But then there's also another point, and I'll stop. I went a lot longer than I thought I would, but there's one other point I want to make with that, is that God recognizes that they're naked, and then God makes animal skins for them to cover them up, and that's an important thing. So animals apparently had to have died in order to cover Adam and Eve. You're never going to ever completely heal from your brokenness in this life, I'm sorry to say. But there are things that can help. There are things that can, in the process, cover you and clothe you and make you not feel so vulnerable as you used to. But in the story of the fall, it's the clothing that God gives Adam and Eve. Like, the fig leaves are not adequate. Our own actions, our own attempts to cover ourselves are not adequate. You've got to go to God. You've got to confess. And God can clothe you in something that, like, it's weird. Like, he can't make you go back to a state in which you're still naive. But he can give you clothing to cover your nakedness. But how often is that clothing offered in the context of church? If somebody comes, can they be clothed? Are our churches filled with people sitting in fig leaves? I've wondered about that. I'll talk to you guys again soon.